Hello everyone! So you told me that you wanted a React tutorial, and today I'm going to bring you not some boring to-do list application, but a much more fun Pokemon application that allows you to see all the different Pokemon, paginate through them using hooks and all of the modern React features, starting now. But before we get started, my React course is launching just 1 week from today, so if you haven't already signed up for the email list, to get the exclusive discount, today is one of the last days you have, so make sure you do that if you're interested in the course. Also, if you're watching this from the future, you can use the same link in the description in order to check out the course since it's already been released for you. Now, actually, let's get started. So in order to save us just a little bit of time, I've already gone ahead and run the npx create react app script with period at the end. All this does is it runs create react app and generates all the files that you already see inside this project. That's the only thing I've done so far. It just takes a long time to run, so I figured you didn't want to watch me do that. And the next thing that we need to do is actually just delete a bunch of the code that it generates, because it generates a bunch of boilerplate placeholder code. So we don't need this favicon icon, we don't need any of these logos, manifest, robots. All we want in the public folder is this index.html, and we can just leave this as is. So the next thing, inside of our source folder, we can just remove the CSS, the test files, all the logos and the service workers. We don't need any of that stuff. And inside of our app.js, we can actually just remove all of the code inside this return. We just want to return null. And we can also remove these imports up here. We don't need the CSS or the logo. And now if we save that, all of our code is exactly how we want it. Just a very bare bones application that does absolutely nothing, which is perfect to get started with. In order to run this, we can just run npm start, and this is going to run the application for us. And if I just move this over to the side, this is the API that we're going to be using. And as you can see, our application has opened up on the side over here. And you can see we have an error in our index.js, and that's just because we haven't removed some of the code we're not using. So make sure we remove that CSS file, the service worker, and all this service worker stuff down here. We just want this single line with these 3 imports. Now if we save that, you should see our app refreshes and is completely empty, which is exactly what we want for this application, so we can just start from scratch. We can head into our app.js, and this is where our application is going to be built. But as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, this is the API that we're actually going to be using, this Poky API, and essentially what it allows us to do is query all of the Pokemon that are available. As you can see here, if we just go https://pokyapi.co/API v2 Pokemon, we get a list of results down here that have the name of the Pokemon and the URL for much more detailed information on them. But for our cases, all we're really worried about is this name, as well as this next and previous section, which allow us to do pagination inside of our application, because by default, only 20 results are returned at a time, and we want to be able to allow our users to go from just the first 20 to the second 20, third 20, and so on. Now to get started, the first thing that I want to do is think about the different components we're going to be using in this application, and for our cases, it's actually straightforward. We're only going to have 2 components. Well, 3 if you count the app, I guess. But the main 2 components we have is our list of Pokemon, which are just going to be the names of the Pokemon, and then pagination section, which allows us to hit next and previous buttons to go forward and backward throughout the different pages that we have available. So let's create those components now. We just do that in the source folder, create a new file. For our case, we're going to have a Pokemon list.js. And if you have the extension installed, which is over here, it's called ES7 React Redux GraphQL React Native Snippets. It allows you to just type RFC and enter, and that's going to generate the code here for a React functional component. If you don't have that installed, you can type this all out by hand, but I find this snippet makes it really easy to work with React components. So here's our Pokemon list created. We'll save that, and we'll create another file. We'll call this one pagination.js, and in here we can do the same thing, React functional component, RFC, and hit enter, and that'll generate all this boilerplate code for us. And that's all the components that we're going to need for our application. The next thing that we need to worry about is the different state that we're going to be storing inside of our application. So we can do that in our app.js. And in order to store state in a functional component, we need to just import the hook, which is useState. And this will allow us to use state inside of our application. So we can save that. And now we can actually use state in our application. And the main state that you're probably thinking of that we're going to need to store is the list of Pokemon that we're showing on the screen. So the way useState works is we call the function useState, and we pass it our default state, essentially our initial state, which in our case, there is going to be no initial state, so we're just going to leave this completely empty. But what it does is it actually returns 2 variables for us inside of an array. So we're going to destructure that, by using these brackets here. And if you're not used to array destructuring, make sure you check out my video that I've done on it. I'll link it in the cards and the description down below for you. But essentially, the first parameter of the array is going to be the first element in the array that's returned, which in our case is going to be just the Pokemon. It's the current state that we're using. So this is our current state, which in our case is for our Pokemon. And then the second variable here in our array is going to be the method we can use to update our state. So we're going to call this setPokemon. So essentially, we have here our actual Pokemon, our data, and in the second one, we have our way that allows us to update that data for our application. So when we go to a different page, we can call setPokemon and update the list of Pokemon that we're showing inside of our application. In order to get started and just see what our application will look like, I'm just going to add some default state of just 2 different Pokemon. For example, we can here have Bulbasaur, and then we can also just put in here Charmander, just so we have 2 different entities inside this Pokemon variable to play around with. And as I mentioned, this is the default state, so the very first time our component renders, it's going to put this information inside the Pokemon variable over here on the left. And what we can do inside of our return statement is if we import our Pokemon list component that we created, so Pokemon list from, and when you're inputting a local component, you can use // to get your current directory, and then we see here our Pokemon list, so we can import it just like that. And down here, we can actually render that. So we can render our Pokemon list, and we just want to make sure we pass it here, the props, which in our case, all it needs is a list of all the Pokemon to render. So now we're passing our Pokemon down to our Pokemon list. Inside of that Pokemon list, we can actually use those Pokemon. And again, we're going to use destructuring. So we're going to destructure the props. And inside of here, we just know that we're passing it a variable with the name Pokemon. So we're going to destructure that from the props argument. Because right now, this is props, and we have props.Pokemon being passed into it. So we can just actually take this one step and just destructure it here. It just makes it easier to work with small parameters that you're getting in from your props. Then we can come down here and actually render that information inside of this div. And an easy way to do that is if we use these curly braces here inside of our JSX, we can actually run JavaScript code. And we can just say what we want to do is loop through all these over a map. So we're going to say Pokemon.map. And for each Pokemon inside that collection, what we want to do is return some code. So we're going to actually use normal brackets here, parentheses. And then everything inside these parentheses will be returned from this function. So in our case, we're just going to return a single div, and inside that div, we're going to put the name of the Pokemon, which in our case is just that P variable, because our list is just a list of arrays of names. And then when you're in React, you actually need to have a key for every single thing that's inside of an array. So every time you have a loop, such as like this, you need to have a key on your top level element, and this key needs to be unique to that element. So in our case, we're just going to put the name of the Pokemon, because we know we're never going to have any duplicates. This just allows React to easily render things efficiently, and so you just need to know to put a key anytime you have some form of loop inside your React code. Now if we save this and come over here and look at our code, you can see that it's actually printing out both Bulbasaur and Charmander, which is exactly what we want it to do, and each one of them is on an individual div with the key being set so React knows when to re-render individual ones if it needs to. Now this is all great that we have this working in React and it's rendering, but it's just a static list. As you can see over here, we wrote this list ourselves. What we want to do is we want to actually dynamically create this list from the API that we have over here. So what we're going to use is we're going to use a library called Axios, which just allows us to fetch from APIs easier than using the default fetch from the browser. So let's install that by just typing in here npm I Axios, and that's going to install the Axios library for us, which is going to allow us to make asynchronous requests to an API such as this Poky API. And now that that's done being installed, we can actually import Axios from that Axios library. And now we have access to Axios, which works very similarly to how fetch works. So if you're used to fetch, you can get used to Axios. And so for example, if we want to get something from the API, we can just say axios.get, and we want to pass it the URL we're going to be using, which in our case, we can see over here, our URL is this https://pokyapi.co/api/v2/Pokemon. So if we just paste this inside of here, this is going to make a fetch request and it's going to return us a promise. So what we can do is we can just do a .then on that promise. And this promise has essentially the response for our request as the variable that gets returned, and has a property called data, which is going to be all of this JSON that you see inside of here. So this res.data is all of the JSON that we see here. And then inside results is an array for all of our different Pokemon. So we can say res.data.results. This is going to be our actual Pokemon, and we just want to get the name from each one. So we can say .map, and And what we want to do for each one of the Pokemon in this array, we just want to get the name from them because we're getting an object with a name and a URL, and all we actually want is the name. So then we can actually come in here and we can set Pokemon, whoops, if I spelled that correctly, to that. And now this is going to actually set our Pokemon variable to that value. And this is going to look like it works if we save this and come over here. You can see we're getting an error, and that's because by default, Pokemon is undefined. Let's just set this to an empty array by default. And now if we save this, you can see this is actually looking like it's working, but this is not the correct way to actually make these types of requests in React. This is what we would call an effect. It's something we want to happen and then re-render our application when it does happen. So we need to use what's called useEffect to make this work. And this is just a hook that you can import from React. So we can import useEffect, and then we can actually run these effects every time we re-render our application, or just sometimes based on the props that we pass it. So let's get started by wrapping this in a useEffect. We can just come down here, type in useEffect, and this just takes a function. This function is going to be run every single time based on the props that we pass down here. We essentially pass an array of arguments. And every time one of these arguments change in our array, it's going to rerun our effect. So for us, right now, we just never want our effect to re-render itself, so we're just going to leave this array empty, so the effect is only ever going to run one single time. Let's bring our code from Axios up into our useEffect section over here, and now if we save that, you should see nothing over here actually changes. Our code is doing the exact same thing, but now we actually have this working properly, where our useEffect is being hooked up properly with Axios, and everything is only going to re-render once. So if something else in our app component causes it to re-render, we're never going to refetch these Pokemon list. We're only going to do it that one single time, which is great. It is so much more efficient now. Now, in order to make it so our application is dynamic and actually can change which one of the pages we're on, right now we only ever view the first page, so we can only see the first 20 Pokemon. But if we want to be able to make it so the users can go to the next or previous page, we need to set up some state to do that. So let's set up a state which is going to track the current page that we're on. And this is just going to be our URL, just like this URL here, which is going to be our current page. So we can just come in here and we could say current page URL. And we also want to have set current page URL. And we're going to set that equal to useState. And by default, this current page URL is going to be set to this URL down here. So let's just copy this up into the useState in here. And by default, our current page URL is going to be set to the first initial page. And we also want to make sure we use this current URL inside of our get down here. Also, you may notice that every time we change our current page URL, we want to refetch our Pokemon. So we want to pass that as a parameter down here to the useEffect. So now our useEffect says every single time current page URL changes, rerun the code inside of it. And if it doesn't change, then don't bother re-rendering that code. Which is perfect because we want to re-get the Pokemon every time we go to a different page. You'll see this all once we start to get the next and previous buttons hooked up. But if we do save this, you should see everything over here renders just as before, so we haven't broken anything, which is great. Now let's just copy this down, and we want to do the same thing, but for our next page URL, and we want to have set next page URL, and by default, this is just going to be completely blank. And we want to do the same thing, but this is going to be for our previous page URL and for setting our previous page URL. And if you remember from our API, if we scroll down just a little bit, make sure we change this to be just Pokemon, hit submit, you can see we have next and previous at the beginning of our request. So we know that we can actually just take this next variable from our request, and this is the next page inside of our pagination. So down here, we can say we want to set our next page URL to our response.data, which as we know is our JSON over here. We just want to set it to the next property, which is this URL for the next page. And we want to do the same exact thing, but this time for the previous page and for previous right here. So now we're setting the next page URL, the previous page URL, and the Pokemon every single time we make this fetch request, which is perfect. Another thing that we want to make sure that we do is actually give our application a loading state. Because right now, when we re-render our application, it just starts as a blank page, and then after the API request, it renders everything. But to a user, it may look like our site is broken if we just show them a blank page. So instead, we want to show them some type of loading screen. So again, we're going to use some state to set up a loading application. So we can say loading, this is just going to store true or false for if our page is loading, and we want set loading. And of course, we're going to use some state. And by default, we're going to put our application in true. We're going to say by default, our application is loading. And then instead of our useEffect, after our request is successful, we can actually set our loading to be false, because now we know that we have all of our data, so we're no longer loading anything. And every time we make a request, we want to set the loading to be true. So every time that we need to make a request, we're going to make it so that our application goes back to the loading state. And every time our request completes, we're going to go out of the loading state and actually render our application over here. And to make our application really simple, we're going to come down here, we're going to check if loading is true, and if so, we're just going to return some really basic text that says loading with a few dots at the end. Now if I save that, you should see it had a little flash of loading at the top. And an easy way to see this is we never set loading to false. And we save that, you see it'll just say loading forever. But we of course don't want that, so we're going to set loading to false, and you just see that quick little flash of loading. But if you're on a slower internet connection, it'll say loading for longer, so your user knows it's actually working and that your site isn't broken. The last thing we have left to do is actually set up what happens if the user calls this useEffect multiple times in a row before the request has finished. You're going to have a race condition and things could overwrite each other. We want to make sure we cancel every old request every time we make a new request. And the great thing about useEffect is it allows you to return a function, and this function gets called every single time useEffect gets called again. So essentially it allows you to clean up after the last call, and in our case, it's going to allow us to cancel our previous request every time we make a new request. And Axios has a really great way built into it that is going to allow us to do this. We can pass a second argument, which is the options that we want to pass to Git, and it has something called a cancel token. It takes an object, and this object is a new Axios.cancel token, and essentially this cancel token, all it does is take a function, and this function returns here the cancel token that we need. So all we need to do is set something to the C variable, and the C variable we can call C.cancel, and it allows us to cancel our request. So let's just create a variable called cancel, default it to nothing, and then inside of here, we want to set cancel equal to C. So now every single time our Axios makes a call, it's going to set our cancel variable here to this new cancel token. And then down here, we can just say cancel.cancel, just like this. And we can just put this on one line to make it easier to read. And now this is going to cancel our request every single time we make a new one, just in case we have an old request. It just makes sure our application never loads old data in case the old request finishes after a new request. It just cancels it, so we never have that problem. And actually, instead of saying cancel.cancel, this cancel is just a function itself. We just call cancel. So that was my bad. All we have to do is just call cancel, and it'll cancel that for us if there's a current request going on. And if we save, you'll see everything over here still works as before, so we haven't broken anything, which is great. The next thing we want to do is set up the pagination, which is really the thing that's going to allow us to make this a very dynamic web page. And to do that, we need to create two functions, one for going to the next page and one for going to the previous page. So we'll just scroll down here a little ways, and we'll create a function which is called go to next page. And this function is going to be very simple. We're going to set the current page URL to the next page URL. Super straightforward. Same exact thing, but we want to go to previous page. And you guessed it, we're going to set the current page URL to the previous page URL. These are really basic functions, and our pagination component is actually going to use these functions in order to go next or previous, depending on the button we hit. So let's make sure we put our pagination component down here. And of course, we want to make sure we pass those different components to it. So what we can do is we can just say our go to next page is going to be equal to that go to next page function. And the exact same thing with previous. So now our pagination component has both the next page function and the previous page function being passed to it. And in order to make it so that we can return both of these elements, we need to put them inside of a fragment, essentially just an empty HTML element. That way we know that we're rendering both of these, because if you don't do that and you save, we're going to get an error because it's trying to return two things. And in JavaScript, you can only return one object. So we could just return this empty object, which is going to wrap both the objects we actually want to return. And of course, nothing's changed over here because our pagination component is completely empty. So let's actually come in here. We know that we're going to get a go to next page function and a go to previous page function, just like that. And we can use these inside of this div on two different buttons. This button is going to say previous, and we're going to have another button which says next. And our previous button is going to have an onClick, which is just going to call that function, go to previous page. And our next button is going to have an onClick, which is going to call go to next page, just like that. Now if we save, you should see we have a previous and next button, and when we click next, it'll load and render the next section. Previous, it'll load and go back to the page we were on before, but you'll notice that if we click previous now, there's nothing to load, so it's just going to load forever. We were already on the first page. So we actually want to hide this previous button when we have no other page to go to. And a really easy way to do that is to just make a check here. We can say if go to previous page, and then we want to render our button. And this is a really tricky way to do an if statement inside of React. What we do is we put the variable we want to check. So we're saying if we have a go to previous page function, then render everything after the and. And this works because in JavaScript, if you have an and statement and the first section is false, it'll never run the second section because it knows false and anything is always false. So it just quits out. It says, okay, this is false, I'm done, continue on. But if this first section is true, true and true could be true. So it needs to check this second argument to see if it's true. So essentially it'll say, okay, render this button. This is just a tricky way to do an if statement in React, and you'll see this all the time in React code. We can come down here, do the exact same thing with our previous page, and put the bracket over here, and we save, and you'll notice that both our previous and next button are still being shown up. And that's because inside our app, we're always passing these functions, no matter what. So we want to do a quick if check in here. What we can do is we can say if next page URL, this is going to be a ternary. So essentially what it's saying is if the next page URL is true, then pass something here, which in our case, we want to pass the go to next page function. Otherwise, anything after the colon is what we want to pass if this is false. So if we don't have a next page, we're passing null. We can do the same exact thing over here. We can say previous page URL, if that's true, pass that function, and if it's not, just pass null. Now when we save, you'll see down here, neither of our buttons are showing up, so obviously we have some form of problem going on with our application. This code right here looks fine, so let's look at our pagination, and you'll notice right here is the error. I put go to previous button on both of these, while this bottom one should say go to next page. Now if we save that, we should hopefully see our next button. We click it, it loads our next page, and now our previous button shows up because we have a previous page to go to. We can click next a few more times, you can see our loading screen is working, and this will go all the way until we get to the last page. There's a lot of Pokemon, so obviously I'm not going to click this button all the way till we get to the end. And that's all it takes to make a simple React application. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn a ton more about React, make sure to check out the React course linked in the description. I go over so many features of modern React, and by the time you're done with that course, you'll know everything you need to know about React in order to start building any project you can think of. So with that out of the way, thank you very much for watching this video and have a good day.